So welcome to another week of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Seminar Series. We are well into the fall quarter now, and the complete lineup for the fall is available on the website at beth.ucla.edu, so be sure to check that out. Next week we have Robert Wayne coming from the UCLA Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department, and he's going to be talking about the evolution and diversification of the domestic dog. And this week we welcome Tom Flamson, who is a recent UCLA PhD graduate and is now at Santa Monica College. And one final note before we let Tom begin, and that is that we have a bit of an ant problem in this room, and have been asked if we could please just try to clean up as well as we can to try to prevent that from getting any worse. So thanks for that, and sorry about that. Welcome, Tom.
So thanks, my name is Tom Flamson. I'm currently a research affiliate here and a professor at Santa Monica College. And today's talk is going to be the work I did completing my dissertation here in June on the encryption theory, a theory of how humor could have evolved as an honest signal. And I promise there will be some jokes. People expect cartoons and humor talks. But first, I'm going to get a little theory background first. So it's not a controversial statement to say that humans are dependent, to some degree at least, on culturally transmitted information, that we need culture as part of our regular operating system to be able to successfully thrive as human beings. And it's also not uncommon to notice that there's a fair amount of variation between cultures in terms of the kinds of things you transmit, of information, skills, attitudes, norms of behavior, and so forth. It's been suggested there can be coordination benefits to being able to assort along these lines, to form groups of people who share norms, that have access to similar information and skills and attitudes, and that this benefit might have driven the development of ethnic markers to show individuals which group of norms they adhere to and demonstrate which ones they don't. And there's been a fair amount of work recently since McElrath et al. Published the first paper on ethnic markers and between group assortment and how you can use cultural information to signal affiliation and draw lines between people. But there's another realm of assortment that hasn't been as closely investigated, which is within group variation. So in addition to wanting to assort between different groups, there's also room within groups for individual variation. You can have differences in knowledge and experiences and personality and preferences. Now these things may be purely developmental noise. There's variation in personality, maybe just because it's a complex system, it inevitably has some variation, or it could be some adaptive benefit. Perhaps there are frequency-dependent selection for different kinds of personality types. Regardless, the fact that there is noise is the relevant issue. Exactly where that noise came from is a different conversation. Another thing about human behavior is that a lot of our coordinated activity relies on so-called mind reading, the ability to develop an impression of the goals and desires and intentions and understandings of others. And that this will be easier between individuals with similar knowledge. The closer someone is to your mind, the easier it is to form a representation of what they're likely to do. So it's been shown that individuals can gain a fitness benefit by coordinating with other individuals who are more similar to them, that there's benefits to be had by finding the people most like you for coordination. In addition, it's been suggested that there are some benefits to forming long-term investments, long-term relationships with people with similar long-term interests. So all these things suggest that there should be some kind of mechanism for facilitating assortment within groups as well as between groups. So there should be things about human behavior that help us find those within our local group who are most similar to us. And this poses a slightly different problem than the between group assortment problem. Whereas between groups, you can afford to burn bridges. You can afford to say, I'm part of the red team, you're part of the blue team, I don't want to interact with you. I'm showing all the other red team members that I'm one of them. But within groups, you don't have that option. Within groups, you may want to find the optimal partners for long-term interaction, but you still will need to interact with everyone else in the group. There may be things that require more than your close circle of friends to achieve. Between group conflict requires coordination within the group. So when you're finding the best partners within the local group, you don't want to burn bridges with the other members of your local group. You want to find a way to covertly assess similarity, to show who you're like without necessarily pushing away people you're unlike. And this, I suggest, is where humor comes from, is where the capacity to produce humor and to find things funny originated. So it's widely known that humor is one of those universal human features. Everybody in every culture has some instances of humor production and enjoyment. It's overwhelmingly a social activity, and it's very variable. Not only is there a lot of variation between cultures in terms of what is considered humor, and importantly, what's considered an appropriate venue for humor, neighbors, much less people from radically different cultures. The structure of humor is typically very odd. It violates Gricean notions of how pragmatics of conversation should work. And I would suggest that these features reflect not a curious byproduct, but actual design for humor as an adaptation to the presence of culture. Humor as an adaptation to the presence of variation within cultures that enables people to assort. And this is what the encryption theory of humor is proposing. So the idea, put simply and technically, is that humor is an adaptation for honestly signaling compatibility and local cultural variation among potential long-term interaction partners. And this has three components to it. The first is encryption, the idea that the process of producing and understanding humor relies on what I call an encryption-decryption process, which I'll go into shortly. But because of that, it now provides an inference of similarity, that producing humor shows some instance of being similar to the person who appreciates the humor, and that this evidence of similarity is then used for assortment, so that successful humor will ultimately encourage affiliation with compatible local peers. And this was published with Clark Barrett a couple years ago in the Journal of Evolutionary Psychology. So here's an instance of humor. That's going over about as well as I hoped. So it's a bit obtuse, it's not readily funny, and in fact, to get this, you need access to some implicit information. You need to know some things to see why this could be funny, even if you didn't find it particularly so. You need to know Sesame Street is a children's show. It's about trying to educate children. There's this character, the Count, who teaches children numbers by counting off numbers and enjoying each one. And that there's ethnographic claims that in some cultures, they only have three number terms. They have 1, 2, and many, and that's it. So in a primitive culture developing Sesame Street, the count is effectively done. And the idea is that when people produce humor, when people are sending out jokes, that they're relying on access to that kind of implicit information, to knowing about the 1, 2, many number system in order to produce a joke about it. And this is what is called the key. That when people are producing humor, they're relying on this key, this bit of information that you need to be able to unpack additional lines of inference, additional lines of meaning in what's being said. So when a speaker addresses an audience, he can produce a humorous utterance. And if an audience member doesn't have access to the key, he's not going to get any of the encrypted content. He's just going to get the surface features, just see the words were produced, they weren't particularly interesting, and move on. But if an audience member does have access to the key, then in addition to discovering that surface content, he's going to be able to look inside and infer the other lines of meaning that are contained within the utterance. And that, in turn, indexes that the speaker must have had access to the key, because to pack additional meaning into this utterance through applying this key, it's very unlikely to happen randomly. So by the virtue of showing access to the key in the joke, the audience member can infer that he has that similarity with him. Further, when the audience member laughs in response, the speaker can draw some inference of the audience member also having access to that key. Now, there is some thought that people are able to laugh even when they don't get a joke. There's some evidence that people might be able to tell the difference, that there are some cues to honest and dishonest laughing. But even without complete reliability, without being 100% honest, it's still a fairly reliable index of finding something funny. People usually laugh realistically when they hear something they find funny. They usually don't laugh realistically when they don't. So this means that you can use humor to honestly index the similarity, to show that you, the speaker, have had access to this implicit information, that the receiver most likely also has access to that implicit information, and that you two resemble one another, in fact, of this point of access and this bit of similarity within local cultural variation. Now, individuals who have more in common, who have greater resemblance, are going to have more occasions for successful humor. The more you and I share, the easier it's going to be to make a joke that we both can get. So this is going to encourage assortment in the long run. So as you iterate this over many encounters, as you produce various jokes, peening the local environment to find which people send back a laugh in response, you're going to get a better idea of the relative resemblance amongst various speakers in the audience and various speakers and various audience members. So you're going to be able to use this to indicate your relative similarity to local group members. As I mentioned, this can be useful if you're trying to find people to coordinate with, people who are similar to you and will be better mind-reading coordination partners. So over the long term, humor should facilitate assortment for greatest compatibility in locally variable features of things like personality and knowledge, values and experiences, and so forth. So you can think of this as being a problem of discovering an invisible world. So this representation shows a speaker and various audience members who have some degree of overlap in things they have in common. So there's some things that they share, and there's some things that are different. But the speaker doesn't see this. He doesn't go out and see this person is obviously more similar to me and that person is obviously less similar. The speaker just knows there's people out there that may or may not have some overlap. But as he produces jokes, he can start to get some impressions. So he produces just one joke, both people laugh. That's similarity with both. It's not particularly useful for discriminating between them. But as you start having more humorous interactions, and some things only the red guy finds funny, some things only the blue guy, some things no one finds funny, and as you increase the amount of humor you're putting out there, you're going to get a clearer and clearer picture of how much overlap there is. And with that picture, you can start to make an inference about who I most closely resemble within the local group, and then assort with the optimal partner. So to test this hypothesis, it proves to be a little tricky because humor is a fairly subtle mechanism. It's ubiquitous, but it's often hard to get concrete lab studies showing people producing humor. In fact, it's almost impossible to get them to produce humor in the lab. And in addition, I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting humor is the only thing people use to socially assort. So there's going to be other factors in real-world assortment that are also determining who people are friends with. So people should also, in addition to wanting to find most compatible partners, they may want to find the most high-status interaction partners they can manage. They might want to find more attractive interaction partners, all else being equal. There's lots of other things people might draw on as well. So humor is going to be one of many mechanisms involved in the complex process of social assortment. So to get at whether or not this is working the way I think it does, I use a variety of methods to try to triangulate on the answer. So we have some laboratory studies, some field studies, some ethnographic analysis, and putting them all together, these converging lines of evidence, I believe, do show this kind of adaptive design in the use of humor. So first I want to show you a few lab studies. These were also in that 2008 paper. The first one involved online experiment showing narrative jokes. These are the kind of story-written anecdotal jokes that you'll find in Reader's Digest or other kinds of magazines. There was about 200 subjects, and they were presented first with 5 control jokes to sort of establish a baseline, make sure they weren't marking everything as maximum or everything as minimum. And then they were presented with these 16 test jokes. And for each joke, they either received a high encryption or a low encryption version. And so in the high encryption, they had no additional information provided. They got just the joke as it was originally written. And in the low encryption, information was provisioned. They were given some of the information you normally would need to know already in order to find that joke funny. They then rated how funny they found it and took filled out a self-report of how much they knew in advance of the various topics of the jokes. So what we predicted was that because you need access to implicit information, that because you need to know something to get these jokes, that first there should be some main effect of prior knowledge. That people who know about the thing already are going to rate the joke more highly than people who don't. But because this encryption manipulation is changing the availability, is giving them more information to draw on, there should be some interaction there, where for people with prior knowledge, the high encryption jokes should be funnier than the low encryption jokes, because on those things that you already know what it's about, getting the extra information provisioned makes it a less reliable signal. It's more obvious, it's more clever because you already knew that. Whereas if you don't have that prior information, finding it, giving you that information provided is going to make it funnier because now you know what you need to know to get it. So for some examples, this study was conducted many years ago when this was a more relevant joke. So Jessica Simpson and Nick Lachey are walking along the beach, enjoying the sights and sounds of the ocean, and suddenly Nick says, "Jessica, look at the poor dead birdie," and Jessica looks up and says, "Where?" Whereas in the low encryption, we've provisioned some of the information that helps people know why that would be a funny joke. You tell them these are some celebrities, and one of them has a reputation for being particularly stupid. And then they're asked how, whether or not they knew about this person and various other joke topics beforehand. So what we found is that there was, as predicted, the main effect of prior knowledge, that knowing about the material beforehand made you more likely to find the joke funny, or made you find the joke funnier. In addition, there's an interaction between knowledge and encryption along the directions we predicted. So we compared these with a paired samples t-test and found that amongst those individuals who received a high encryption version of a joke, those without prior knowledge found it a lot funnier than those without prior knowledge found it a lot less funny than those with prior knowledge. Whereas amongst those getting the low encryption condition, the effect was not as strong. So high encryption meant that prior knowledge meant more. Conversely, amongst those who had prior knowledge, they preferred high encryption jokes than those jokes that they had knowledge for that were low encryption. Whereas the opposite was true for people without prior knowledge, that it was funnier if you got the information than if you didn't get it in advance. The second study wanted to look at another take on this same sort of approach, where because the one feature of the response was that most people knew most of the things in that first study. The topics were fairly broadly accessible pop culture items. There were a lot of things that people knew everything about, and they couldn't actually be used in the analysis. So we wanted to use a more obscure source of humor where there was a greater chance that some people won't know some of the topics. So we went to The Onion, which is a satirical newspaper, and got a number of headlines to use these experiments for. Again, we got almost 200. And this time, rather than ask them to self-report their knowledge beforehand, we gave them a more rigorous check of prior knowledge, where before any of the jokes, they filled out a 30-question pop culture trivia quiz, where they were asked who is the thing that this applies to. Then they got the jokes. And this time, instead of changing the joke itself, we provisioned information individually. So each joke was preceded by a short paragraph. And in the high encryption condition, that paragraph was irrelevant. It wasn't stuff you need to know in order to get the joke. But in the low encryption condition, it was the relevant information. It was the things you needed to have some knowledge about. And again, they rated it on a Likert scale. So first they would get a trivia quiz, who sang Sunglasses at Night. Then they'd either get a high encryption condition where there's some information that's not particularly helpful, or a low encryption condition where the specific references being made are laid bare, and then they get the joke where they can see what all the Corey Hart stuff was about. And here again, we found this main effect of prior knowledge, that knowing about something beforehand made you find it funnier than not knowing. And there was also a main effect of encryption. This time, the interaction didn't work exactly the way we expected, and it's probably because of this greater obscurity of the jokes. Because what we found in this comparison is that the high encryption condition basically stayed the same, that not getting the information provided for you meant that if you had the prior knowledge, you found it a lot funnier than if you did not have the prior knowledge. And in the low encryption condition, it still made the people with prior knowledge find it funnier, because perhaps these jokes were so obscure that even if you could answer who Corey Hart was, that little bit of information gave you some extra information that you needed to find the joke funny. So again, we found this difference between low and high encryption for lacking prior knowledge, where those without prior knowledge preferred the low encryption condition. But here, the people with prior knowledge also found them funnier if they got a little bit extra. So what this tells us overall is that prior knowledge matters, that knowing something about the joke made a difference in understanding it, and that provisioning information, manipulating the kind of information that's available, further impacted how they found it funny, and it interacted with their their knowledge of their prior knowledge. But there was also apparently an effect of this overall obscurity, that some things were so obscure, some jokes were so inside, that everybody benefited from getting additional information about them. So this suggests that humor is understood by means of an encryption-decryption process, that you have some reliance on access to this implicit information in order to find something funny. Now to look into to test the other elements of the hypothesis, to look at similarity and assortment, we really need to look at a real-world population of people who actually are part of a social group. So rather than do some more online studies, I went to Brazil, to a collective farm in the state of Ceará, the northeast, a little bit north of this city of Boa Viagem. And this collective farm is organized into 3 villas spread out across the territory with a number of different features. So it was collectivized in 1997, and before 1997, it was a traditional sharecropping plantation. So the people who lived there were basically serfs, but in 1997, they were able to collectivize and jointly own the farm, which radically altered the social makeup. So now they rely on communal cash crops. They all work together as a means of generating income. They each have their individual fields and orchards and livestock, and there's some other joint ventures like fishing partnerships and some other cooperative endeavors. So there's a range of coordinated activity. There's some things everyone does as a group. There's some things people do in a family unit or in a group of friends, and there's some things people do individually. There's about 300 people living there, but they're organized by household, which is headed by the assentado. So each of these 64 houses has one person on the board of the assentamento. Most of them are male, a few are female. Ages range very widely. They have a wide range of children as well. And often there are aunts or grandparents living with the family as well. Roughly half were born on the farm, were raised as sharecroppers, and the other half were born somewhere else and came to the farm when it collectivized. They came to move in to this new endeavor. About 2/3 of them were traditional Brazilian Catholics, and about 1/3 are evangelical Protestants, which is a rising movement in Latin America and a strong source of a kind of within-group identity. So that central villa, the one in the middle, Antigua Boaventura, was the original settlement before collectivization. Originally, there was one big house where the landlord lived, and then a number of huts spread out throughout the farm without a lot of concentrated households. So that house in the center there is actually well over 100 years old. Those other 2 have been built since then, since collectivization. This has the smallest population. It's largely people who were originally sharecroppers on the farm, who were either born there or moved there long before collectivization, and in fact are mostly members of one large extended family. That contrasts with the agrovilla, which is called Madeira Cortada, which was built after collectivization. When all these new people arrived and the people who were already there wanted better living conditions, they built this large housing settlement where most people live. So about half of them are there. They have these 2 lines of houses going down an open field. There's a few social gathering places. There's a couple small shops, these TV benches where people gather at night to watch a show, and the primary school. And then finally there's Os Poreiros, which is the most isolated settlement. So this settlement is built around a few of the old houses over the mountain range that runs across the farm, so it's quite a trek to get up there. It has a small population. Most of them are members of the Pereiro family, and it also has a higher proportion of evangelical Protestants than most of the other places on the farm. So one of the things I wanted to look at here was how their understandings of humor would track with their social networks. So first they engaged in a replication of that study, the online study, where they were given trivia questions beforehand, rated some jokes, and the conditions were manipulated by the kind of information being provided, whether they got relevant or irrelevant information. And again, they rated funniness. And these materials, because about half the adults are non-literate, I had the local school teacher read a long script that I recorded, and then I chop the files up to present counterbalanced random orders of all the materials. So there were 40 participants, but 5 of them got so few of the trivia questions correct that there wasn't either prior knowledge and low encryption or prior knowledge and high encryption. So they had to get thrown out of the overall analysis. And this, again, is replicating that early study. And in addition, I wanted to look at how their social networks work. So here we have an actual population that has real relationships, and how do those relationships track with their understandings, their preferences for humor. So during an earlier interview session, I presented them with a photo sorting task where they were given headshots of all the other asentados, all the other seat holders, and asked to organize them in ranking of who you know better, who is a closer friend, who is a closer relative. So all of them participated producing these rankings of 1 to 63, where 1 is someone either you don't know or you actively dislike, and 63 is the closest person, your best friend or your closest relative. And so this social network information was applied to the dyads generated by comparing everybody who participated in the humor ratings task. So that produced 528 dyads where I averaged their closeness. So person A rated person B 60, and person B rated person A 56, so their average closeness would be 58. And the prediction here is that, again, for encryption, it should work much as the online experiments did. Because you need access to this implicit information to understand the humor, prior knowledge is going to increase your joke ratings. And because we're provisioning information through this encryption condition, then there should be the same interaction, where if you have the prior knowledge, you'll think it's funnier under high encryption conditions. And if you have no prior knowledge, you'll think it's funnier under low encryption conditions. Further, for the assortment, now we can see if these humor preferences are tracking social networks as predicted, where because what you find funny should index your underlying similarity, people with greater social closeness, people who have a higher average ranking in their social networks, should have a lower difference in joke rating. So they should either find the same jokes funny or the same jokes unfunny, but their individual ratings should be closer than people who are further apart in their social networks.
Tom, could I ask about that prediction? So wouldn't you have to control them for prior knowledge? So let's imagine, okay,
Yeah,
so.
that's in there. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
So first, the encryption results. Again, we find this main effect of prior knowledge. You need to know these things to find them funnier. And the comparison shows a very similar pattern. Now, those other online experiments had ends of close to 200. This has 35. So the only significant result here is the high encryption condition, where prior knowledge made it funnier than no prior knowledge. But you recall that I had to throw out a few of the participants because they didn't have enough prior knowledge to fit in all 4 cells. But if we want to just look at this one contrast, so within those that didn't have prior knowledge, we can add in those other 5, and now we're starting to get approximately significant. So I think it's fair to think that there might be a simple power issue here, and that future studies getting more, a larger sample size might show that this same general pattern is going on, where high encryption means access to knowledge is driving your response, and the manipulation of how much knowledge is available, whether it's a widely available one where you're adding the information, or a more obscure one where you're adding a lot more information, is changing people's responses. Now, in terms of the social closeness results, first we wanted to control for prior knowledge, and actually control for a whole bunch of things. Differences in individual age that might speak to cohort effects, whether they're practicing the same religion, if they both lived there or didn't live there. And what you find is that of all these things, only 2 things seem to matter. One is, as predicted, that social closeness reduces the difference in your ratings. The closer you are in a social network, the less difference there is in how funny or unfunny you found a joke. And the only other effect here is practicing the same religion, which I think is probably driven by the evangelical Protestants. So when I was doing interviews about use of humor in their daily lives, I actually had one of the recent converts say that he doesn't laugh anymore since he became evangelical. Apparently there's some within group assortment effect there too. So looking just at these effects of social closeness controlling for the experimental conditions, we're seeing this effect of closer you are, the more in common your joke ratings. Another way to look at it is in terms of just take all these dyads, break it apart into the half that were close to each other and the half that were distant from each other. And whether they have different prior knowledge, they both know it, they both didn't know it, or whether they had different encryption conditions, so they both had the high encryption or they both had the low encryption. Across all these different conditions, the same pattern holds, that the closer you are, that being, in this case, and being in the category of socially close groups, you found the jokes more similar, either funny or unfunny, than the more distant people did. Mm-hmm. This is largely
These are
illustrative.
differences in ratings. Okay, so I was trying to figure out what
Mm-hmm.
the axis is. So differences in ratings. So there's a bigger. Okay, so you want it. Okay. Now I'm.
What's the scale actually go?
So the scale would be, the jokes were rated 1 to 7, so the absolute maximum would be 6. But I don't think there's many with 6.
And the minimum
Would be 0, right.
And what would the standard error be, or standard deviation?
Don't have, I might have that in the final slides. I don't have that off the top of my head. This was really to illustrate what this is showing. Just that these groups, breaking them up into these two categories, you see that closer people have a smaller difference in their ratings, which is here. So again, we find this prior knowledge effect, and that encryption's making a difference in some of the conditions, at least, replicating our prior finding. And also that greater social closeness is associated with similar evaluations of jokes. That similarity in humor preferences is reflecting their real-world social assortment. That the people who are closer in the social network have more similar senses of humor. Now that's in response to comedy, to this professionally produced kind of humor that is not really the kind of thing that people interact with in their day-to-day lives. They're not getting humor from showing each other Onion articles or from showing each other, telling each other jokes they've read in books. There's some of that going on, but most humor is going to be conversational humor. It's going to be individuals producing humor for each other. So the next one I wanted to look at was how people evaluated how funny members of their group were. So if they knew which people they thought were funny or which people they thought were less funny based on their actual experience of those people producing humor. So this was with all of the asentados. Each of them rated 10 targets who were a representative sample of the variation in the group. So they were weighted from the different settlements. They had half were born there, half moved there. About 2/3 were Catholics, about 1/3 were Protestants. So all the different features were given to the target. So there was this range of the population. And they rated them on how funny they thought they were and on these dyadically relevant and globally relevant traits. So dyadically relevant traits were things like, is this person friendly? Is this person someone you can rely on? Is this person someone you spend time with? Things that reflect the experience of a dyadic interaction. Whereas the globally relevant traits were more reputational based. So whether is this person have a reputation for being a jokester? Is this person well respected in the community? Are they considered lazy, or are they often the butt of other people's jokes? And these last two were reverse scored. So when we see numbers later, a higher laziness actually means being less lazy in order to make everything compare better. And these results were compared with their social networks. So the ranking of how close they were within the group towards the target by subject, and various demographic variables about other features of similarity or dissimilarity. So the prediction here is that because people are going to be preferentially sorting with those that they find more similar, then people who they find funnier are probably close to them. Because funniness is an index of similarity, those that they find funny should be those that are part of their social group. And because this is more of a subjective and evaluation and dependent on dyadic compatibility, that there should be a greater effect of funniness on social closeness than some of these other globally relevant effects. And finally, that when you're looking at the dyadic compatibility, that even controlling for other features that might impact individual assortment, that the higher funniness ratings will predict higher ratings on the other dyadically relevant features. So first, this social closeness, looking at the effect of funniness controlling for all these various demographic variables, only 2 of them have any impact. So funniness is significantly predicting social closeness. The people you find most funny out of these targets are the people you're most likely, you're closer to in your social network. You're also closer to them in your social network if you live next door. So people who live in the same location as you do, in the same villa, are going to be better friends than the people who live half an hour hike away. And unsurprisingly, relatives are also closer in social networks than non-relatives. But these other things, being part of the same age cohort, having been born or having moved to the farm, being members of the same religion, none of these things significantly impacted social closeness. And for the second prediction, checking the effect of funniness on social closeness compared to these other more globally relevant traits, we find that people are, that funniness is a stronger predictor, that you are more likely to be socially close to someone that you find funny, and it has a greater effect than being well respected or being, having a reputation for being funny.
So the N is.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out how this was structured in the analysis. Because you asked.
So it's a hierarchical regression. So it's
So you have X subjects reviewing 10 targets.
right, and it's running through the dyads, and then it's the XT mixed analysis is designed to control for that problem.
I understand.
How many subjects?
So there was a total of 64 subjects. Now in these later analyses, I think it's 62 because 2 of them refused to evaluate how lazy somebody was, sort of on principle.
620?
Right, so this one had the 618. There's actually a few, so obviously they couldn't evaluate themselves. And in 2 cases, one person was the brother of one of the targets, and the other was the mother of one of the targets. So they had the dummy comparison I put in there for when the targets were doing evaluations.
Seems to me that that's not the right end for presenting, because it's going to make people like me ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
So the mixed effects regression is supposed to take account of the
Yeah.
individual effects.
Yeah. So it's clustering them by these. Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's, I see that you use the mixed effects model. That's how come I was wondering about it. But I don't know how it's coming. Just
Mhm.
confused me.
Okay. And so the final comparison here is actually 3 separate analyses looking at the effects of these funniness and these globally relevant traits on each of these individual dyadically relevant traits. So in the case of friendliness, funniness had some predictive value in determining how friendly you thought someone was. Now it also was predicted by how well respected they were and how much of a reputation for telling good jokes they had. And this might reflect some ambiguity on exactly what friendliness meant, whether it was friendliness to me as an individual or friendliness as in gregariousness, as a personality trait. Interestingly also, laziness, so friendly people were also expected to be less lazy, or less lazy people were thought to be friendlier. For reliability, again, we see funniness is significantly correlated with how reliable you found this person to be, that there's some relationship there. There's also, again, this relationship of these other global traits, but the funniness effect remains. And then finally, for how much time you spend with them. Is this person you like to spend a lot of time with? Finding them funny had a significant impact there, as again did these 2 global traits. And also this marginally significant relationship that would indicate that the people you spend more time with are likely to you think are more likely to be the butts of jokes. And that probably is simply opportunity to observe people making fun of the people you hang out with. Uh-huh.
Is the spend time actual time spent, or is it you would like to?
It's actual time spent, yeah.
Actual.
Yeah.
So that's kind of surprising because well-respected
Yes. So the well-respected people in particular are sort of the greater social actors, the ones more active in the organization of it. And I think it's because the well-respected people are out interacting with everybody, and the less respected people are keeping to themselves. So across the board, we're seeing that funniness is having a significant relationship with these various dyadically relevant traits. Now, there's also other features that have such a relationship, but even when they're being controlled for, funniness is still showing its role. And also interesting things like people who aren't lazy are seen as more friendly, and people you hang out with, you think the people who are butt of jokes are the people you spend more time with. But broadly speaking, what we're seeing is that closeness in social network is predicted by perceived funniness of target, that how funny you think someone is tells us something about how close you are in their social network, or how close they are in your social network. That it is more predictive of that than these other globally relevant traits, that while it would be good to have high status people as close in your social network, and while it would be good to have non-lazy people, that what's really more successful here is your dyadic interaction with them. And that when we're looking at these dyadic traits, even if there are some perceptions of the people you think are friendly or the people you think are well respected, there's still a strong relationship between perceived funniness and friendliness and reliability and spending time with them. So what this is showing is that interpersonal evaluations, your opinions of people within your actual social network, reflect, your real social assortment reflects your evaluations of how funny they are. That there's some relationship between whether or not you think someone's funny and whether or not you're close to that person. Now another angle at exploring how humor is working here is to look at actual humor production, when people are specifically making jokes, not just how people are evaluating one's ability to make jokes. And I want to give you a little bit of background about this domain first. So there's been suggestions in the past that people should have some kind of funny tone of voice. There should be some kind of way of marking that you're using humor, that you're in a humorous frame, or that you're changing your tone of voice, your prosody, to show now it's time to listen for a joke. And it's been suggested we'd see that in prosody, in the rhythm and stress and intonation of speech. One positive result was a neural study showing that there's a correlation between having problems understanding prosody and having problems understanding humor in stroke victims. But most of the other evidence that's out there is negative. There's no distinctive features and punchlines when people produce humor. And Greg Bryant and others have shown that when using verbal irony, which is, if not a kind of humor, then at least a very close cousin, speakers tend to contrast prosodic features quite variably. There's no consistent pattern of being ironic. So there's no real ironic tone of voice. And similarly, is there any funny tone of voice? Well, from the encryption hypothesis, we would predict the following. So given that marking humor is going to facilitate detections, telling a joke in a funny tone of voice, presenting extra indicators that now it's time to look for other lines of interpretation, it's going to make it easier to find the presence of humor, which is going to degrade the signal value. So if you're drawing people's attention to the fact you're telling them a joke, it's less reliable as this honest index of access to the information. So you'd expect that people will mark their humor. They'll use a funny tone of voice, or they'll say things like, "Let me tell you a joke," when the context calls for broadening their alliances, when they're looking to form new friendships, so they're finding new people to affiliate with. Whereas they shouldn't mark their humor when they're trying to reinforce existing relationships, when they're interested in enhancing the depth as opposed to the breadth of their allies. So we looked at the use of conversational humor at the Brazilian Collective. Now it's notoriously difficult to study humor in a laboratory setting. That when you set people in a cold gray room and ask them to be funny, you get nothing. But conversational humor is pretty ubiquitous. It's easy to go out in social groups and find people making each other laugh, find people telling each other jokes, saying things that they find humorous. The problem is that for analyzing prosody, ambient noise is also ubiquitous. So in the field site, most of the places where I acquired recordings of conversational humor, I also acquired recordings of passing trucks and braying donkeys and all kinds of other things that make analysis of prosody somewhat difficult. But there was one context that did enable good controlled setting for getting these samples, and these are the collective board meetings. Oh, and this is accepted. I actually got an email today that we're this close to being in press for pragmatics and cognition, so it should be appearing shortly. So these collective board meetings are held monthly, where the entire assentamento comes together, all the seat holders come together to discuss business. So there's the president addressing the crew and various group members. They hold it in the local schoolhouse, so they have comfortable school chairs. So I recorded instances of spontaneous humor from two board meetings, one in January and one in May of 2007. And they were identified by the presence of laughter. Either the audience laughed after somebody said something, or the speaker laughed as he was saying something. Now, this is not going to identify all instances of humor. There's going to be things, people will tell jokes that people don't laugh at because they don't want to laugh out loud right there, or because they didn't think it was funny. But it is a good first pass for identifying humor that's not making presumptions about intention. So it's also possible that people said things that they didn't intend to be funny, but if they were found to be, we still included them to analyze. So we got 24 usable samples, these various traits, and broke them into three segments: into the non-humorous baseline, something that was being said that wasn't part of the joke, then the setup for the humorous statement and the punchline, and remove the laughter and other non-production features of the sound, and then analyze them for various acoustic features. So we looked at the pitch, the mean fundamental frequency for each type of utterance, and its variability, so the standard deviation in fundamental frequency, and its range. We also looked at loudness, so how the mean amplitude and the variability in amplitude, so how loud people are speaking and whether they're changing how loudly they speak. And finally, the speech rate, the milliseconds per syllable of the utterance, to see if they're speeding up or slowing down their speech as they get to humor. So the idea is that if there's some kind of acoustic marking going on, we should be able to detect it by looking at these various traits and seeing if there's some kind of significant contrast between two consecutive segments, between baseline and setup, or between setup and punchline. So if there is marking, there should be some significant pattern of contrast, whereas because the encryption theory is saying that you shouldn't be marking your production of humor in this kind of context, there shouldn't be indicators of I'm telling a joke now, that we expected not to find any kind of acoustic marking. And the sampling method actually works against the encryption hypothesis here, because laughter might be suppressed, because people in this context might not laugh uproariously because it's a more serious time. Then those are the kinds of jokes that are most likely to be the most encrypted. So the most hard to get, least marked jokes weren't included in this analysis. It's the jokes that were recognized and are more likely to have some kind of marking if there is any marking there. So overall, we found what was actually found in the looking for an ironic tone of voice, which is there is numerous significant contrast between the baseline and setup, or the setup and punchline, but there's no consistent pattern. That there's no particular feature that is indicative of telling a joke or not. So there's some kind of significant contrast in 68% of the baseline versus setup pairs, and in 73% of the setup versus punchline pairs, but there's no significant effect. Maybe instead it's not a matter of exactly what contrast, but a matter of piling them on. That if you're marking it, you add more contrast to make draw attention to it. But here again, we find no relationship. So,
What are the numbers on the horizontal? Or numbers in contrast?
right. So that's the data of the next slide's analysis.
Okay.
That out of the 5 ones that can be analyzed this way, they had roughly the same average number of significant contrasts. There wasn't a pattern there as well. There's no, at the level of these, there's no overall pattern that people are marking their humor by producing some kind of funny voice.
So did that mean that like one would be pitch and then two would be pitch and something else?
In the number, yeah. So any one,
Yes, sir.
yeah, any possible combination.
What's the sample size?
The 24 instances are, each instance has 2 comparative pairs.
So I'm wondering how much power we have.
That might be an issue.
We might do it,
Mhm.
I
Okay.
mean, they're pretty small. The effect size is pretty small, but if looking at the pictures, it didn't look. Anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not much there.
Mhm.
But,
Well, beyond this, we looked at another level of analysis here. We did so this is showing the various means and standard deviations of each category. And we did a repeated measures MANOVA across these. Now, the overall model was significant, and the only significant effect, the only thing that was found that turned up any kind of significant result was in amplitude. So there is some kind of difference, and it's apparent in this baseline being lower than the setup and baseline being lower than the punchline. There is a difference between the baseline and the setup and punchline components. There seems to be people getting a little bit louder as they get into the joke. Now, this may reflect marking, or it may reflect being louder to be heard as people are starting to laugh at your joke. And there's no difference between these two. There was also a marginal effect of range of fundamental frequency that was driven by the contrast between the baseline and the punchline, but that too may reflect just an attempt to be heard in a noisier environment. So what we found overall was that there was no systematic marking, that people didn't seem to be taking on a funny tone of voice, taking on some way of showing people, I'm telling a joke now. And that's as we'd expect, given that speakers can improve their signal value by not marking humor in this kind of context. In a context where you want to favor depth over breadth, you shouldn't be marking humor. You want to keep your signal honest so that the people that are your friends and are your allies are reminded of that. So this is limiting the number of audience members capable of detecting it, as opposed to trying to draw more people's attention to the presence of humor. So this speaks to the idea that what humor is accomplishing is verifying similarity. Is the reason encryption is there, the reason encryption works is not because specifically to exclude people, but to guarantee the authenticity of the producer, to guarantee the authenticity of the similarity between the producer and the receiver. Yeah, that's forthcoming. So, what we found overall, prior knowledge is interacting with the availability of information to mediate the appreciation of humor. That people's humor preferences reflect real-world social assortment, and that people's evaluations of individuals' humor abilities reflect their real-world social assortment. And that when naturalistic humor is being used, at least in this context, it's being used to verify similarity. It's being used as the encryption hypothesis would predict. So these support the notion that humor is designed to rely on this cognitive mechanism of encryption, to rely on this encryption-decryption process, which honestly indexes interpersonal similarity, which in turn facilitates assortment within the group for the people that you're most compatible with. And this is a novel kind of honest signal. This is a signal that's not kept honest by virtue of the cost. It's not a matter of what you're investing in to know. This is because you're trying to coordinate with people who share that similarity. And the structure of it enables you to honestly index this access without actually excluding people. So it reflects an adaptation to the conditions of cultural groups that already have between group variation. They're already marked into cooperating groups, wherein you want to find a further level of optimality by finding the best people to spend the most time with amongst those you've already decided you want to spend time with. So for this to happen, you need cultural variation within these groups that are already ethnically marked. And it's going to depend on there being some benefit to individual differences in things like style and preferences. And so it's likely to reflect either because there's adaptive value to individual differences in these traits, or because there's such a complex system that there's inevitably noise. Playing on that variation enables you to get a little more benefit out of exactly who you interact with. So there, once again, is the basic idea that humor is an adaptation for honestly signaling compatibility and local cultural variation amongst potential long-term interaction partners. And thank you.